our program now, and I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Valerie Burnes from the University of West Alabama. She's a native of Talladega. She graduated from Judson College in Marion, the Black Belt, and then she went on ahead and did her dissertation on the implications of African American slavery in the Black Belt. She has moved to the University of West Alabama in Livingston with her husband, who is also a professor, and she is an associate professor of history there at the University of West Alabama. She has been recommended by the state Centennial Suffrage Committee as one of the noted speakers to try to vie for her expertise in this area. So we were extremely lucky to get on her schedule and for her to agree to travel from Livingston today to be with us. I've warned her that we ask lots of questions. So she's going to tell us in what mode she wants us to ask these questions. And I'm sure she will leave us much better informed and much more thinking to be done on the challenges ahead for suffrage, particularly in Alabama. So I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Valerie Burnes to us today.
Thank you, and I'm gonna, let's see. Found the right button. Okay. So thank y'all for having me. How's the sound? Everybody good? Okay, great. Yes, you are welcome to ask questions throughout the talk, because if you're like me and you don't, you're going to forget. So you're welcome to just raise your hand. I'm glad to stop. I will say that, so I am a history professor at the University of West Alabama. The worst class time, hands down, is 12:30, because everybody's just eaten lunch and they're tired, right? So hopefully I'll be able to keep you awake for the next 25, 30 minutes or so. Just background real quick, because sometimes people ask, how did I end up doing women's suffrage? I graduated from Judson College, which of course is Alabama's only women's college, and so got to grad school and was like, I'm going to do women's history. I ended up changing from women's history to civil rights movement in Perry County, and wrote my dissertation on that, and had written this paper actually in 2002 for Wayne Flint. If you're familiar with Alabama history and Wayne Flint. I pulled this paper out actually just this past year when I was asked to speak about this again, and there was a note on that paper that said you should submit this for the History Department Writing Award, and I never did. And I thought, if Wayne Flint's telling you to submit a paper, you really probably should have. So that will be one of life's regrets. But anyway, I had really enjoyed this research when I did it back in 2002. And so as I moved from Judson to from Auburn to Marion after I got married to teach at Judson, the paper moved with me. Moved me from Marion to Livingston, and 3 office changes at Livingston. So it kind of always hung on, and Steve Murray, the director of the archives, I had gone through grad school with him in Auburn, and he remembered I had written this paper. I was like, this paper was kind of a bigger deal than I realized apparently. And so as we got ready to look at 2020 and the centennial of the 19th Amendment, he asked if I'd be willing to resurrect it, and I was thrilled to do so. So the way I'm going to break the talk down, as far as the overall statewide movement, it breaks into 2 parts. So about 1890 to 1905, 1910-ish will be the first part, and I'm going to introduce you to a woman named Frances Griffin. The second part picks up really about 1915 through to 1920, and so we're going to talk about Pattie Ruffner Jacobs, okay? But we're also going to talk about a wonderful woman, Adella Logan, from Tuskegee. And so she's kind of working through the whole time, and we're going to look at the way race plays into the women's suffrage movement as well, okay, especially talking about Logan. So I'm going to introduce y'all to some women who I have really come to sort of admire. Great role models for a lot of people today, even. Just as a background, and I know some of y'all are in law as well, if you were a woman prior to the 19th Amendment, you had no rights. Okay, I don't think this comes as a shock to anybody, but you had absolutely no rights. You could not bring suit in court, but in that wonderful way that our justice system works, you could be sued, right? It's also like you had to pay taxes, but you didn't get to vote on who made the tax laws, right? If you had children in the 19th century, if your husband died, your children were considered orphans, and you had to petition the court for your children. Okay? Property rights, again, women had none, although they did have to pay property taxes. And then this idea of the consent of the governed. So is everyone basically familiar with the 1901 Constitution? Yeah. Nobody's ever been like, yeah, we know the 19th. I was like, yeah, we know the 1901 Constitution. There's this woman, Frances Griffin, who I mentioned, and she is going to address the 1901 Constitutional Convention. And so I want to read to y'all what she says at that meeting about the consent of the governed. By the way, you're going to love her by the end of this because she is a spitfire and very sarcastic in a very bless your heart kind of way. She's a lot of fun. She goes to address the Constitutional Convention to try to get women's suffrage written into it. But here's what she says about the consent of the governed, to give you an idea about how her mind works. Very, very smart. Thousands of years of bitter arguments and bloody wars were required to evolve the principle that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. This thought is the guarantee of liberty of the republic. It is the watchword of people striving for political freedom. Now comes the declaration that women as well as men belong to the governed, and upon that belief, I ground my demand to the application of the principle to citizens regardless of sex. So that's kind of her first argument to that Constitutional Convention, that women should have the right to vote. And there's going to be some more great stuff that comes from her. Okay, so how did women get to suffrage in the first place? Nobody, for the most part, just woke up one day and said, women need the right to vote. They were kind of pushed in that direction. Missionary societies were women's first foray into public work, okay? And that kind of fits, right? Because missionaries saving the souls of people, that's sort of women's job, right? So that's a good fit. WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, was the first nationwide women's organization, 1874. That's how Frances Griffin, who we're going to hear a lot from today, that's how she got involved in the suffrage movement. Anybody know why they had a problem with alcohol consumption? What do you think? Why would women especially have a problem with alcohol consumption? Abuse, okay? Men go to work, they bring their income home, they go to the bar and spend all their money, which would be great for you, but not for me, okay? He's like, yeah, that's a great idea. And tip while you're at it, right? Okay. But for a lot of women, they said, so many of society's problems come from alcohol abuse, okay? We have poor children who are starving to death because husbands are spending their money on alcohol. We have domestic violence, okay, because of alcohol. So they pinned a lot of the country's problems in the late 1800s on alcohol. The problem was women couldn't do anything about it, okay? They could try to end the consumption of alcohol. Here's what the WCTU would do. They would show up in front of bars and sing church hymns. And they were pretty powerful. They would sort of block the entrance, and these men would have to walk by them, doing kind of the walk of shame. Okay, sorry. Occasionally, they would go into bars and just ask the owners to close, and sometimes they would, even if just for a few days. They had one lady who would actually just take an axe into the bar and just chop the bar up. So that's what they had to resort to, though, because they couldn't get anything else done through the law. Child labor, if you're familiar with Jane Addams' Whole House in Chicago, this is how she gets to suffrage, and our local Pattie Ruffner Jacobs, who we're going to talk about today. And then factory and mine conditions. Jacob's, it's kind of ironic, Jacob's husband was involved in the steel industry here in Birmingham. So she saw firsthand what these working conditions were doing to people, especially children, because you could start working at 5 years old. And if you start working at a factory at 5 years old, or in a mine, a coal mine, at 5 years old, you're twice as likely as your counterparts who aren't working in factories or mines to be dead by 20. Okay? And you're gonna die of cotton lung or black lung, okay, by 20. And then the typical workday is 10 hours a day, 6 days a week for 5-year-olds. Okay? And they love 5-year-olds. Why do they like 5-year-olds? They're small, they can fix things that our big adult hands can't fix. And what about pay? You have to pay practically nothing. Okay, so they love kids. The issue is, though, that, oh, is that blocking the sound? The issue is, though, that these women can work for all these reform movements, but they can't do anything about the base problem because they can't end child labor. That has to be done by law. They can't end alcohol consumption. That has to be done by law, okay? Now, your First Amendment right, you have the right to petition the government, and these women would do all kinds of petitions, and they would get hundreds of thousands of signatures on petitions, mostly women, and they take those to the government, their elected officials, and what do their elected officials tell them? Oh, thanks, we appreciate that, but none of y'all can vote, so we don't really care. Okay, that's what's going on. That's how every single woman ended up in suffrage. They started in something else and realized that we can work all day to end these problems, but we're never going to be able to fix them as long as we can't vote. So Frances Griffin, born in 1843, graduates from Judson College, yay, in 1860 at 17 years old. That's a little bit of a problem because what starts in 1861? The Civil War. So she never marries. She doesn't have kids, and that actually is going to give her a little bit of advantage in this. And she is very well educated, and she's very, like I said, very smart. This picture of her hangs in the archives in Montgomery. I've seen some photographs. This picture actually kind of makes her look pretty good. She definitely moved forward in life based on her brains. She's originally from Wetumpka. Spends most of her life there. She starts off as a teacher, right? Surprise. She does get involved, like I said, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. 1889, she addresses their national convention in Chicago. There are newspaper articles in nationwide newspapers about Frances Griffin of Alabama speaking first at WCTU conferences and later on at NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, conventions as well. And she sort of develops a little bit of a cult following. Like they found out Frances Griffin was going to speak, and people just showed up just to hear her speak. She is very smart. She's very well spoken, and like I said, she's a little sarcastic, and she lays it all out there. And then of course, you know, why suffrage? She goes into these great reasons why women should have to vote. She moves from WCTU to suffrage. Okay, she speaks at the NAWSA convention in 1899. And then, of course, at the 1901 Constitutional Convention. When she speaks at the 1901 Constitutional Convention, she is the first woman in the history of the state of Alabama to address a legislative body in Alabama. They had to suspend the rules to let her speak. So this is great. They show up at the Constitutional Convention. They show up and start work at noon, 12 o'clock. They end their work day at 12:50. Like, no wonder it took y'all forever. And they suspend the rules, and they let her come up and speak. But they had to vote to suspend the rules, and some guys didn't want to do that. And then they had to vote to let her speak. And several guys voiced their displeasure about that. The problem was she had found out on Friday that she was going to be speaking Monday. And so she put the word out, and the gallery was packed with women wearing yellow roses in support of suffrage. And so all these men who had voiced their nay, that they did not want her to speak, when they had to actually raise their hand to vote, only one guy did, because the rest of them chickened out. He was from Selma, and chair of the convention, John Knox, makes him escort her to the stage to speak. So it's like, that's your payment for just not being smart, dude. She doesn't get to speak at the podium. She speaks next to the speaker's desk. Okay, but that's kind of where we are. Okay, and she's going to run the Women's Suffrage Association in Alabama, pretty much as a one-woman show in 1903 and 1904. Okay, so everything I'm going to read to you from this page comes from her 1901 Constitutional Convention address. Okay, she talks about the idea of silent influence. If you're not familiar with this, the idea was when men went to vote, women had a silent influence on them, and so they would vote to represent women. Now, I don't know about y'all. I love my husband. We don't see a lot of things the same way, okay? And he is not going to vote to represent me when he goes somewhere, okay, and when he goes to vote. And so here's what she says about silent influence. This old foolishness about a vote lessening that silent influence so much talked of is disproven. Did you ever hear of a man who wanted to be disfranchised in order to increase his silent influence? I have found the silent influence is a little too silent in the ears of legislators. Okay, so it just doesn't work. Regarding the idea of politics is corrupt, a lot of women said, well, we clean up things, we'll clean up politics. Okay, and she said, you know, regarding the idea that politics is too corrupt for women, politics is what men have made it. Government may be divided into 4 segments: the state, society, church, and home. The state is the only one from which women have been excluded. The other 3 have been maintained to the highest standard, but the state has become so corrupt that it's not fit for women to have a part of it. Well, of course it's corrupt, but it's because women have been kept out of it. If men alone had tried to manage all those 4 departments, they all would by this time have been demoralized. The combined influence of both men and women is necessary to bring everyone to their highest state. It is said that the real religious creed of the people, the unmistakable evidence of what they actually believe, is their politics. But women have a trust in religion and no politics, while men have a trust in politics and, judging by the state of public affairs, no religion to speak of. If you want to purify politics, add in women. That is what she says. Okay? The idea that women aren't smart enough to vote. She asked the question, do women know enough about politics to vote intelligently? Now, what's funny about these is whoever's doing the transcription for it, this Constitutional Convention write-up, put in their personal take on it. And so they would say things like applause, laughter. Men laughed. When she asked that question, it says laughter. So when she said, are women intelligent enough to vote, the men there laughed at her. Okay. And she said, I see you think you know the answer, but I'll give you some information just because I have it. And she goes on to say that there are more women enrolled in college, even in 1901, than there were men. Of course, that's true today as well. And she says, our colleges have doubled in numbers within 10 years, and the number of women who are getting ready for college is astonishing. Add to this their temperate lives, as a rule for which must be in a woman's favor. They neither steep themselves in tobacco nor besot themselves with liquor, so that whatever brain cells they have are kept intact. There's no laughter after that one. That was the funny thing. You laughed when I asked if women could vote, but you don't laugh after that. True nugget, okay. Regarding the idea that women aren't soldiers, can't fight, and so therefore they shouldn't vote. She said, after the Civil War, they found that a large majority of the doctors, lawyers, ministers, and educators examined for military duty were found to be physically unfit, and therefore didn't fight. And she said, you know what that means? They didn't go to war. So while only a small fraction of the unskilled laborers were found disqualified, the professional men as a class could not fight. So should the suffrage be limited to only unskilled laborers and disfranchised professional men? Well, what does everybody at that Constitutional Convention do for a living? They're mostly lawyers, right, and businessmen. And so she just hit them kind of right where it hurts. So she says, the old, the infirm, the lame, the blind are freely admitted to vote, so find some other reason for excluding women than the fact that they do not fight. The idea that politics is a burden to women, she says it will lessen our burden. Because once we can vote on laws to end child labor, we don't have to work with that anymore. Once we can vote on laws to end alcohol consumption, that's less work we have to do. If we can hit these problems at the root, we don't have to hit the problems later on. Okay, so she addresses that as well. She says with the idea that not every woman wants to vote, if voting was based solely on the number of people who wanted to vote, then men wouldn't be allowed to vote either, because we rarely have even 50% voter turnout. And so voting rights are not based on the number of people who exercise them. You have rights because you're a citizen of the United States. Okay, so she's very smart with those. And then this, men can speak for women. Actually, it's going to get involved in race. She realizes that the true purpose of the Constitutional Convention is to disfranchise African Americans from voting. And she says, I'm a single woman. I live in a house with my sisters. We have no man to represent us except our 22-year-old black gardener. We've been educated for reasons beyond his control. He has not. If he goes to vote right now, he's the only person that would technically represent us as a man voting for our household. And she says, but by the time this Constitutional Convention's over, even he's not going to be able to vote. Okay, so that doesn't work either. Women need to be able to vote for themselves. There is one bright spot in this 1901 Constitutional Convention, and that is this gentleman, Benjamin Craig of Dallas County. Surprisingly, Dallas County, Selma, is the hotbed for the women's suffrage movement. They're later on going to join with some women from Birmingham to form the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. But Craig introduces several bills for the convention to have women given the right to vote. And the best one, he actually does this so much that a gentleman from Calhoun County actually makes a motion to ask the gentleman from Dallas County to quit making women's suffrage motions, because he did it so much. But anyway, Craig recommended to the Committee on Suffrage and Elections that on the matter of municipal bond issues, women be allowed to vote for their taxes, right? The measure was approved, right, by a vote of 65 to 45, and thus a portion of women in 1901 had gained the right to vote. Only on the tax bond issue, but still they'd gotten the right to vote. The next day, y'all know what's coming next, however, Representative Greer from Calhoun County, who's the same guy who asked Craig to quit putting forth women's suffrage amendments, moved that the bill be reconsidered. And so on August 9th, 1901, just one day after gaining the right to vote, the women of Alabama lost that right by a count of 87 to 22. So for one day in 1901, women had the right to vote. They could never exercise it. Okay. So Frances Griffin, by 1905, she's tired. Okay, she's tired of fighting the fight, so she kind of recedes. Pattie Ruffner Jacobs isn't going to show up for about 10 more years. Okay, but Adella Logan is pushing straight through until 1912. She is born in 1863 in Georgia, Augusta, Georgia. Her father is white. Her mother is African American. Her mother's mother, though, was had a white father and a black mother who'd been enslaved. She goes to the NAWSA convention, the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention in 1895, and she only gets in because she passes for white. Okay, and there's a lot of racism in the women's suffrage movement, and you see a lot of women, white women in Alabama, saying, if you allow us to have the right to vote, we will basically cancel out any African American men who are still voting. Okay. Now, Adella Logan is wanting to get the right to vote, right, to help the African American community, right? So that African Americans can have more of a say in the law. And so it's interesting to watch. The suffrage movement in Alabama is very much states' rights based. Okay, NASA is wanting a constitutional amendment. People in Alabama are like, the white women are going to the legislature in 1915. We'll talk about that in a second. And they're saying, hey, if you go ahead and give us the right to vote, we won't have to have a constitutional amendment. You can kind of keep the federal government out of it if you give us the right to vote now, which is exactly what they do after Brown v. Board with schools as well. And you'd see those integration schools as well. So anyway, she's a founding member of the Tuskegee Women's Club. She actually works at Tuskegee. She's the first librarian. She wants universal suffrage, black, white, male, female, everybody. Okay. She writes articles for The Crisis, which is the newsletter for the NAACP, the Woman's Journal, and the Colored American. Du Bois, who's the editor of The Crisis, publishes her first letter. But if you know anything about African American history, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington do not really get along very well. And she sends more letters on women's suffrage to The Crisis, and Du Bois refuses to publish them but once he found out she was at Tuskegee. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to watch how all these things intermingle. Her husband has her committed to a sanitarium in Michigan. As she goes up there, and she was under just a lot of stress. She's working for all these different causes. She's got 6 children. Her husband is having a lot of affairs as well. And she does not have the help with her children that, for instance, Pattie Ruffner Jacobs does. Okay, Pattie Ruffner Jacobs has 2 daughters. Frances Griffin had none. Okay, and so Logan's really juggling a lot more. She was very, very close to Booker T. Washington. And so in 1915, after having been institutionalized, she comes back to Tuskegee, because she hears that Booker T. Washington is ill. When she gets back there, she gets off the train, and basically the first person there says, your husband's been cheating on you while you're gone. Which she knew, she kind of knew that was why. Washington dies a few days later. She had seen Washington as really her father figure. Because, you know, if your father's white and you're born in 1863, you don't really have a very close relationship with your father. Now, he had paid for her to be educated, and she was very well educated. But she really saw Washington as a person who gave her a chance to be a professional, and of course as a father figure.
Is that perchance the reason why Du Bois was rejecting a lot of her submissions, because he and Washington
did not get along? Yeah, remember, he's the one who called Washington's 1895 Cotton Expo speech his accommodationist speech. Yeah, and once Du Bois found out that she was at Tuskegee, he wouldn't publish anything else. Yeah, about it. So he was buried on December 12th, 1915. She went up to the 2nd floor of the administrative office where she worked and jumped out the window and killed herself. Because he was gone, and she just couldn't take it anymore, because she really felt a lot of personal responsibility for gaining rights for the African American community. She's African American and a woman. She's trying to pass in white circles as well. Once they found out she was African American, they actually forbid her from speaking at a NASA convention, even though she had originally been accepted to speak at the NASA convention. And then Susan B. Anthony actually made a very sort of, flat out racist comment about she should just continue to write letters. She doesn't need to be seen in public. Okay. So it's very ugly. And, I tell my students all the time, in the U.S., we break ourselves down by race, class, and gender in that order. Okay. We see ourselves by our race first, and then our class and our gender last. But ladies, we're 51% of the population. If we got over race and class, we could rule the world, right? Okay. No offense to the couple of guys here, because y'all are brave. Okay. Her great-granddaughter has just come out with the book, Princess of the Hither Isles, a Black Suffragist Story from the Jim Crow South, this year published by Yale University Press. And of course, her name is Adella Logan. named after her great-grandmother. So that's an option. All right, we're headed into the home stretch, so bear with me, because I know y'all got to go to work. I will say, I got out of giving a final to come speak to y'all today. So I was excited. Somebody else has got to deal with those very unhappy U.S. History 2 students today. So, the second wave, 1910, really kind of 1915 and 1920. Birmingham girl, Pattie Ruffner Jacobs, again gets her start in child welfare, joins with the women from Selma in 1912, and they established the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association here in Birmingham at the Church of the Advent, which is now the Cathedral Church of the Advent, Episcopal Church, downtown. She actually ends up serving on the National American Women's Suffrage Association board, and then that's going to eventually obviously move over and become the League of Women Voters. Yay! And she serves on y'all's national board as well. She also serves on the Consumer Advisory Board and the TVA in Alabama. So she's very, very active. Okay. So the AESA is created, like I said, from the Selma group, who was interested in child welfare and ending alcohol consumption. The Birmingham group, and is formed in 1912. They wrote newspaper columns. They set up other chapters throughout the state. They traveled a lot. And y'all, they traveled a lot on their own. They actually got a lot of grief for that. And a lot of men said that they weren't proper and kind of hinted that they were prostitutes because they drove themselves around. I was like, y'all, really? That one always just cracked me up. But if you look, even with the case of Adella and Logan, these are very upper class women. Okay, for the most part, working class women don't have time to get involved in the suffrage movement. They're working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. What the AESA does, though, is they set up a tea room in downtown Birmingham for working women to take their lunch break and read suffrage material there. They take the suffrage movement to them. They're not interested in class, okay, because they realize the race issue is still big, the class issue not so much. And they said, if we can get over the class thing, we got a whole lot more women who are going to be able to vote. Okay. Now, in 1913, some women on a train convinced Joseph Green, a state legislator, to give Alabama the women the right to vote at the state level, because if we do that, the government doesn't get involved, the federal government. Okay. And so, in January of 1915, he puts forth a bill for the state of Alabama to give women the right to vote. Now, in case you're wondering why they talked to him in 1913 and they don't decide on it until 1915, it's because at the time the state legislature only met every 4 years. Yeah. So I was like, if you think they don't get stuff done now, imagine if they only met every 4 years. Okay. And so they put forth this amendment, and the women go to work. Okay. There's a little bit of a problem, though, in that, let's see, I got my note on that one. Okay. Green puts forth this bill. If the bill comes up for a vote, and he actually speaks against it. And basically, the best they can figure out is somebody just said, if you do this, it's going to be political career suicide. If you put forth the bill to give women the right to vote, you're not going to get reelected. Okay. File that thought away, because we're going to come back to that. Okay. But that's the best the women could figure. And so he puts forth the bill. They stand up. He speaks against it. Obviously, it doesn't go anywhere. At that point, the women realize we're going to have to do a constitutional amendment. Okay. Alabama is going to become the first state in the South to take up the 19th Amendment. Okay, 1919, it's been 4 years. The Alabama legislature becomes the first state to take it up. Okay. Alrighty, and so it comes to the state legislature. It's put forth to the states. Does fine in the Northeast. Does fine mostly down the Atlantic coast. Comes to Alabama. The women of Selma and Birmingham and the AESA go to speak before the legislature, and they say, we feel we are your equals. We want our right to vote to count at the polls. Women have been too long treated as irresponsible children, and now they want to share what's going on. Okay? After her speech on the vote to give women the right to vote to ratify the 19th Amendment, the vote in the House was 60 to 31 against ratification. The vote in the Senate was 19 to 13 against ratification. So it's going to now be left up to other states to give women of Alabama the right to vote. Does anybody know, by the way, what's the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment?
Tennessee.
Oh, sorry, not the very last state. Sorry. Mississippi. The one who actually ratified it.
Tennessee.
Tennessee, yeah. Usually nobody knows about Mississippi. So yeah, and there's a shop too, right, in Mississippi. It's Tennessee, and it comes down to the youngest legislature, and I love this story. The guy's name is Valerie Burnes, and they're voting based on rank, and they're wearing either red roses or yellow roses, and it comes down to him. He's going to be the tie-breaking last vote, and he's wearing a red rose. And so the anti-suffragists are so excited because he's going to vote against ratifying the 19th Amendment. Well, Valerie Burnes had gotten a telegram from his mama. So moms, if you think you don't have any influence, you are wrong. And it basically kind of said, you know what you need to do, or don't come home for dinner. And so he voted in favor of ratifying the 19th Amendment. The State House erupted in chaos. They chased him out onto a second floor window ledge. And they had to bring in the Capitol Police to get everybody out of the room so the poor guy could come back in the building. And they had to escort him home. Now, I don't know what he did that following Monday morning. He got dinner at least. He did get dinner. Okay, so next time you go vote, ladies, say a little thank you to Valerie Burnes and his mother. Okay, because that's the reason you have the right to vote. So women do get the right to vote. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about Joseph Green, that was the vote for women. That was the 1915 vote, right, for women to get the right to vote from the state of Alabama. When he reversed his decision against his own bill, they nicknamed him the Dallas County Acrobat, because he flip-flopped right on his decision. Okay, so I'm going to end with this. This is Hattie Hooker Wilkins. Okay, and remember, I said, what was the reason we think that they told Green that he shouldn't support that bill for suffrage? What was going to happen to his career?
He wasn't going to get reelected.
He wasn't going to get reelected. So hold on. In 1922, right, so the 19th Amendment does pass and is ratified and goes into effect in 1920. By the way, does anybody know when Alabama ratified it? 1953, yeah. Because some guy in Mobile was like, y'all, this is embarrassing. Like, we need to ratify this. But in 1922, the women of Selma reveled in the culmination of their suffrage work by electing Harriet Hooker, or Hattie Hooker Wilkins, to the Alabama House of Representatives, giving her the honor of being the first woman in Alabama to be elected to the legislature. In her bid for the House, she defeated Dallas County acrobat Joseph Green. All right, who has questions?
Tell me about Mississippi, because you said Mississippi is.
The last state to actually ratify it. Once Tennessee ratifies it, and we have the 2/3 ratification, it kind of doesn't matter after that. So Alabama finally does it in 1953, just because somebody's like, y'all really? Okay. In Mississippi, I think Mississippi was like 1994.
I think it was in the 80s.
Maybe the 80s. Okay.
Yeah,
We'll give them benefit of the doubt.
84, 86.
We'll give them benefit and go with 84 then. But it's the same thing. But by that point, it's just paperwork. Just kind of got to clean up the paperwork. But really, we should probably do that. Yeah. So. And I don't know of anybody that was surprised by either one of those. So I even asked my students, my class, I'm like, how many of y'all think Alabama helped ratify the 19th Amendment? And they're all like, what other questions do you have?
Information about getting that vote in 1953. So it's kind of that anecdotal.
No, I just know that the representative, she's asking about the 1953, when Alabama finally signed it in 1953. I do know the gentleman in the legislature is from Mobile, but that's all I know about it, yeah. And I think it was a case of, this is kind of embarrassing, so, yeah, so we need to take care of that. Yes, ma'am.
So you got 21st century students in your classroom. What did they see as the voting rights challenges of today?
You know, so 18, 19, 20-year-olds are still very self-centric, right? And so their biggest challenge is, I'm not at home to vote. Did I forget to get my absentee ballot? But honestly, they're not really interested in voting. I ask because we talk about voting so much, especially in U.S. history. And so I'll say, how many of you are registered to vote? Now, I will say a good number, over half of them are registered to vote. Because especially if I'm, for instance, wanting to kind of help talk about primaries and how primaries work, or general elections, and just, breaking all that down. But a lot of them, and some of it kind of depends on, okay, they just turned 18 this year. We haven't had an election yet. So there's some of that. For some of my older students, they actually just, if it's not completely easy where like I could do it from my computer at home, they're just not gonna do it. So they're not gonna go stand in line. They're not gonna try to get an absentee ballot. They're just not really interested in it. So, which is frustrating. It's very frustrating. And I tell them, I don't even care who you vote for. That's not what I mean. I care, but I'm not interested in that part of it. One, that I want to make sure you're informed voter, especially in presidential election years. It's funny to ask. I asked the year, and I can't remember. It must have been 2000. Was it 2004 when John McCain and Sarah Palin ran against Barack Obama and Joe Biden? And I asked my students who Barack Obama's vice presidential candidate was, nominee who was running with him, his running mate, and they all said Sarah Palin. Because they'd heard the names a lot, right? And I was like, y'all don't vote. I'm sorry, but if you're not going to bother to be informed enough about the person running for president and the vice president, you need to study something before you walk in there too. So, yeah.
I don't know the answer to this, and I should. How many states allow straight ticket voting like we do? Because that way you really don't have to know anything about the candidates if you just have your color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how many other states. I know Alabama, of course, does.
About 5. She says
about 5. Okay. Yeah. And
by the way, Mississippi does not allow straight voting.
really, yeah. And of course, that's one reason that they have the symbols as well to help alert people who are voting. And I know I go in and I vote for the donkey or the elephant, and that's my ticket. And that it's interesting because so I have a civil rights background in the Black Panther Party in Lowndes County was started in Lowndes County, and that's part of the reason they chose it as a symbol, right, that people would recognize. And so you see that. I will tell y'all, and I don't want to get into the politics of any of this, but you've never experienced voting until you poll watched in the Black Belt.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's a whole nother experience.
Yeah. It's you're kind of running the gauntlet just to get in the front door, and they're handing out pre-filled sample ballots, and you'll watch people set down the sample ballot, fill it in, okay, they go turn in their vote and then their ballot, and also watching people vote for people. And one of those interesting ones I saw was this county commissioner came up to help a young man vote, and the woman this wasn't a primary election too, this wasn't even a general election, although in the Black Belt, if you're elected in the primary election, you're elected because everybody runs on the Democratic ticket in the Black Belt. And anyway, the woman said, why does this kid need to vote, like help voting? And the county commissioner said he can't read. And she said, I taught him 11th grade English. I know he can read. And he cussed at her and snatched the ballot out of her hand, walked off, filled it in for the guy, had the guy go put it in the box. So that's an eye-opener, right? So if you ever want to see something interesting, I'll watch them. But that was Perry County. Sumter County's not really as bad. That's where I live now. But Perry County was interesting. So that'll make you rethink a lot about voting and our voting processes too. So, yes, ma'am.
I shouldn't have asked this, but these women that you've shown us the pictures, you've told us nothing of their life, how old they were, did they have children, were they in their fifties or twenties, when they were interested in politics enough to fight?
So Frances Griffin, the first woman, had no children because she never married. She just, obviously she's going to college though in 1850s into 1860. She's come from a wealthy family. Adella Logan was a librarian, as I mentioned, so she has a professional career and she has 6 children. And then Pattie Ruffner Jacobs had 2. Pattie Ruffner Jacobs died when she was 70 years old in 1935. Frances Griffin died in 1917, so she actually never got to cast a ballot. And I wrote an Alabama Women's Hall of Fame nomination for her, and I ended it with, because I think she's a big deal. She's the first woman to speak to a legislative body in Alabama when she does it in 1901. And I ended it with, she died in 1917 and never got to cast a ballot. My husband, I sent it to my husband, I was like, proofread this for me, because you never proofread your own work, because that's just a disaster. And see what errors you find. And he called me and he's like, I'm so mad. And I was like, what? I was like, what did I do? And he said, she never got to vote. And I was like, yay. This is good. Okay, this worked. And then, like I said, Adella Logan died in 1915 when she committed suicide. So 2 were married and had kids, 1 wasn't.
Was the Ruffner woman, I assume that's your maiden name?
Yes, ma'am.
Was she any kin to the Ruffner that established Ruffner Mountain?
I don't know about Ruffner Mountain, but her great-grandmother, if you've ever read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, his autobiography, Up From Slavery, he goes to work for a woman, and he refers to her as Mrs. Ruffner. And she's the one, she was very, very particular, and she's very picky, but she taught him how to clean. This sounds weird, but she taught him how to clean very, very well. And that is what allows him to get into Hampton Institute. So he leaves working for her, he works his way from West Virginia to Hampton, Virginia, sleeping under sidewalks, working on ships, unloading stuff. He gets to Hampton, Virginia, and by the time he gets there, he just looks awful. Because he's been sleeping outside, hadn't been able to bathe, he's dirty. And he said the people at the school were kind of like, oh, we don't know what to do with you. And so he says that the woman said, well, clean this room while you're waiting, and, we'll come back and try to talk to you and figure out what to do. So he cleaned the room to Mrs. Ruffner's standards. And she came back and he said they were so impressed with how well he had cleaned that they admitted him to the school, and the way he paid for school was he was the janitor to pay for school. That's her great-grandmother. That Mrs. Ruffner is her great-grandmother. So I don't know about Ruffner Mountain, but there's kind of there's a well, no, somebody else has asked me that question, so I should actually go check. But somebody else has asked me that before, so I really should remember to look that up. So, okay, what else?
Time for one more question.
One more.
Anybody?
There's some banana pudding left. Oh, yes. Yeah, so Allison and I are on this centennial committee, the statewide centennial committee for the suffrage amendment. And I'm in charge of a trail that's tasked with identifying suffrage sites in Alabama. And so there's a company, the Pomeroy Foundation, actually it's a foundation, not a company. Pomeroy Foundation is going to sponsor 5, possibly a couple more, markers in Alabama. And they go on sites associated with the suffrage movement in Alabama. And they're doing this in every state for 2020. So right now we have a YMCA building. The catch is the building has to look mostly like it looked in 1920. Okay, we've been good. We've done it. So there's a YMCA building in Huntsville, which is where Susan B. Anthony spoke. Okay, and so that one we're good on that one. The Parish Hall at the Cathedral of the Advent, where AESA was founded, is still there. So that's going to get one. We're going to do the administrative building in Tuskegee, okay, where Adella Logan worked. What is now the Chamber of Commerce building in Selma was the public library. That's where the Selma Equal Suffrage Association was founded. And for Mobile, we actually want to do the home of the legislator who put forth the bill to get us to ratify it in 1953. And we're having a fight with the Pomeroy people because they're like 1920 is the cutoff. And I was like, that didn't really work for Alabama. 1920, we do things a little bit slower here. So we need to, so we're kind of working on that one. But so that's a great program. But we're also doing Alabama Historical Association markers for other sites. So Hattie Hooker Wilkins' house is going to get one. The owner of that house approached me about it, actually. He's a friend of mine, and he mentioned it. I was like, oh yeah, we can do a marker. You got $2,000? He's like, I'll pay for the marker. I was like, we're good. And so we're going to be doing AHA markers as well. In some places we're going to do both markers because the Pomeroy markers are very succinct. Okay, if you want a little bit more information, we're going to do an AHA marker as well. Okay, so, but that's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot about Alabama history, through that. We're looking at a site in Decatur possibly as well. That's another one that we're looking at also. Might do one at the Capitol to commemorate Francis Griffin's 1901 speech as well. So we've got some great sites, some great people.
What about Helen Keller? Are we have to play with Helen Keller?
What was the question?
She was asking about Helen Keller. Maybe we'll look into that one some more. She did a lot of social justice work, and she would have been. I'm not familiar specifically with her suffrage work, but it's a good fit for her. I can see how she definitely would have been forward with that. So that might be one too that we can do, and we can include sites regardless. So like we know where the tea room was that I mentioned that the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association had down. And it's a parking garage now. So we can't put a Pomeroy marker there, but we still can put it on the trail. There's just a national trail, suffrage trail. Patti Ruffner Jacobs' tombstone I think in Elmwood actually. We were having a discussion about that, yeah. Is that where like Bear Bryant's buried and all those? Okay, so she's got a marker there. So we're looking at, we're gonna put that on the trail. I would love to put a marker there as well, because y'all, her tombstone's like this big. That's kind of sad, but people go there because every picture I've ever seen of it has stickers that say I voted on it. So apparently people go vote and then they make a pilgrimage out to Patti Ruffner Jacobs too for her marker to put the stickers on it. So.
Okay, before we thank our esteemed speaker, we have two suffrage-related announcements tonight. So Connie, would you please share?
I just wanted to mention that this weekend,
Microphone.
Sunday, there's a tour of 3 historic homes in Jonesboro on Eastern Valley Road, if you know where that is. It's the McAdory home, the Owens home, and the Sadler home. These are the oldest settlements in Jefferson County, built in 1838, 1839. What is interesting in the Owens home is the home of Thomas McAdory Owens, who founded Alabama State Archives. And by the way, his wife was Marie Bankhead Owens. Marie Bankhead Owens was a prominent anti-suffragist in the state. But I'm not a member of the West Jefferson Historical Society, but I certainly encourage folks to visit. It's Sunday afternoon starting at 1:30. If you get off at exit 1 off of 459, you can turn right and drive about 1.5 miles to the Owens home, then the McAdory home, turn to the left off of exit 1 and go to the Sadler home. The folks dress up in period costumes. If you have grandchildren, it is a great place to take them so they see what it was like before electricity and heat. Because the houses, dress warmly, the houses are as they were built, exactly. So just wanted to pass that along, particularly since it relates with Thomas McAdory and Marie Bankhead Owens. Who's next?
Okay, now I'm going to put Lauren on the spot and ask her to share some of the plans for the day of suffrage, just so we can be thinking about what's to come.
While she's coming up, I will say regarding Marie Bankhead Owen, there's been a lot of discussion about why she was an anti-suffragist. But we kind of figured, well, if your brother's the Speaker of the House and your dad's that's in the Senate, can afford not to vote. You're about the only one, apparently. But yeah, that's kind of always been an interesting case about her. And there were a lot of really prominent women who were anti-suffragists. So we don't really talk about them much.
I wasn't expecting this, and we're not really quite ready with our plans for the day of celebration, but August 22nd of 2020, because the 26th falls on Wednesday, we're gonna kick off the centennial of the 19th Amendment. The State Bar Commission that Allison is head of has chosen me to head up the celebration. So we're in talks with Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, thinking about having an indoor-outdoor event there in Kelly Ingram Park where we can see the documentary that Jenna Bedsoul's putting together on the 19th Amendment and the history in Alabama. We're gonna have exhibits that really detail some of the obstacles that Black women have had in the right to vote, especially because of their role in early suffrage and the delay in their rights, including like a poll test and that kind of thing. We're gonna have Children's Corner where there are books on suffragists that they'll be able to hopefully take home as part of their library. So look out for more announcements. We don't have a definite plan yet, but if you can pencil in August 22nd, it'll be downtown one way or the other. We'd love for you to come out and support us. Thank you.
And the League of Women Voters will be there. We will be doing a voter registration that day, and we will be involved in all activities concerned with the day of and the year of suffrage. And